On a quiet January night in 1973, a 16-year-old boy walks into an all-night coffee shop in Dallas where his mother works. He orders a soft drink, spends a few moments with her, then tells her he's heading home and that he'll help her move the next day. He never makes it back. For the next 52 years, his family lives with unanswered questions. Searches turn up nothing. Leads fade. The case stays open, the longest missing persons investigation in Dallas Police Department history. Then, in early 2026, a newly rediscovered photograph from a separate tragedy hundreds of miles away changes everything. No DNA, no fingerprints, just careful comparison, forensic review, and a brother's recognition of familiar scars. This is the story of Norman Prater, Dallas PD's oldest missing persons case, finally solved. Before we continue with this chilling story, we will like you to subscribe and tell us where you are watching us from in the comments section. It will encourage us to do more and also help the algorithm to suggest our video to more people who like resolved cold cases like this one. Norman Prater came into this world on June 6, 1956 in Dallas, Texas. He was 16 years old in January of 1973, the kind of age when life feels wide open. High school, friends, the first tastes of independence. He lived in East Dallas with his family, in a neighborhood where people knew each other, where evenings carried the ordinary rhythm of the city in the early 70s. Norman was described by those who remembered him as a typical teenager of that time. He had friends he spent time with, places he liked to go, moments when he would walk the streets or catch rides around town. On the night of January 14, 1973, he was out with a couple of friends in East Dallas. They walked together for a while, talking the way boys that age do, about school, about plans, about nothing in particular. At some point, the group separated, and Norman continued on his own. Around midnight, he made his way to the all-night coffee shop where his mother worked. It was one of those classic late-night spots, bright fluorescent lights, the smell of coffee and fried food, a place where shift workers and night owls came and went. Norman walked in, ordered a soft drink, and sat with his mother for a short time. They talked. He told her he would come back the next day to help her move some things. Then he said goodbye, stepped back out into the cool January night, and started walking toward home. That was the last time anyone in his family saw him. His mother finished her shift and returned home expecting to find him there. He wasn't. Hours passed. Morning came. Still no sign of Norman. The family began calling around, friends, neighbors, anyone who might have seen him. When nothing turned up, they contacted the Dallas Police Department. A report was filed. The search began. Norman was young, full of energy, the kind of boy who had plans for the days ahead. There were no signs that he intended to leave home permanently. He hadn't packed clothes or money in any unusual way. He hadn't talked about running away. His family described him as someone who stayed in touch, who cared about the people around him. The idea that he had simply disappeared without warning didn't fit the picture they held of him. The family included his brother, Isaac Prater, who was younger and looked up to Norman in the way younger brothers often do. There were other supportive relatives, people who gathered when the news came, who helped look, who kept asking questions long after the initial searches slowed. They were a close family, the kind that doesn't easily accept silence where answers should be. In those first days and weeks, the Dallas Police Department followed every lead they could. They talked to friends. They checked places Norman was known to visit. They looked for any sign of him in the city. Early on, investigators considered the possibilities that were common in missing persons cases of that era. Some people wondered whether Norman might have gotten caught up with the wrong group or made a spontaneous decision to travel. Others raised the name of Dean Corll, the Houston area figure whose crimes had come to light around that same period and who became known for targeting teenage boys in the early 70s. The connection was considered carefully, but investigators ruled it out. There was no evidence linking Norman to those events, no matching patterns, no credible reports placing him in Houston or anywhere near those circumstances. Still, the questions remained. Why would a 16-year-old leave the coffee shop at midnight and never reach home? Did he accept a ride from someone? Did he decide to head somewhere else for a short time, only for something to go wrong? The family held on to hope. They kept his name alive in conversations. They checked with police regularly. They never stopped believing that one day they would know what happened. As months turned into years, the case grew quieter in the public eye, but not for the Prater family. Isaac grew up carrying the memory of his older brother. Relatives kept Norman's photo, kept the story alive in their own way. The Dallas Police Department maintained the file as an active missing persons case, the longest-running one in their records. Every so often, new tips would come in. Detectives would follow them. Nothing led to Norman. Through all those decades, the family never received any word that gave them finality. No body was found. No belongings turned up in a way that explained anything. No one came forward with information that closed the chapter. The absence itself became part of their lives, an open space where answers should be. Norman would have turned 18 in June of 1974. He would have graduated high school around that time if he had stayed on track. He might have gone to work, started a family of his own, built a life in Dallas or somewhere else. Instead, the calendar kept moving forward without him. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. Isaac and the rest of the family marked them quietly, always aware of the empty place at the table. Age-progressed images were created over the years, standard practice for long-term missing persons cases. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children produced updated portraits showing what Norman might have looked like at 25, at 35, at 45, at 55. Those images circulated in databases, in occasional news stories, in reminders to the public. They showed a young man with the same features, the same quiet expression, but older, shaped by time that had never actually passed for him. The family kept hope alive in small, steady ways. They talked about him. They remembered the boy who walked into the coffee shop that January night, who promised to come back and help move furniture the next day. They held on to the belief that somewhere, somehow, the truth would surface. And then, more than half a century later, in the first days of 2026, it did. But while the family continued searching and waiting in Dallas for all those years, tragedy had already struck 380 miles away in a place called Rockport, Texas, on a July night in 1973, 6 months after Norman disappeared. The night of January 14, 1973, began like so many others in Dallas. The city was quiet in the way winter nights can be. Cool air, streetlights casting long shadows, the occasional car passing on the roads of East Dallas. Norman Prater had spent part of the evening with friends, walking together, talking, moving through the familiar streets he had known since he was small. At some point, the group parted ways, and Norman continued alone. He arrived at the all-night coffee shop where his mother was working the late shift. The place was one of those simple, reliable spots that stayed open through the small hours. Counters worn from years of use, the low hum of conversation from truck drivers and night workers, the smell of coffee always in the air. Norman stepped inside, ordered a soft drink, and sat with his mother for a little while. They spoke quietly. He told her he would return the next day to help her move some things around the house. It was a small promise, the kind families make every day. Then he finished his drink, said goodbye, and walked back out into the night. He never reached home. When his mother finished her shift and returned to the house, she expected to find him there, maybe asleep in his room, maybe waiting up to talk more. The house was empty. Hours passed. The clock moved through the early morning. Still no sign of Norman. The family began reaching out, calling friends, checking with neighbors, asking anyone who might have seen him walking home. Nothing. By morning, the worry had grown into something heavier. They contacted the Dallas Police Department. A missing person report was filed that same day. The Dallas Police Department responded quickly. Officers took statements from the family, from the friends Norman had been with earlier that evening, from anyone who had seen him at the coffee shop. They searched the streets and alleys near the route he would have taken home. They checked nearby parks, bus stops, places a teenager might stop on the way. Interviews were conducted, descriptions were circulated. Flyers were posted with Norman's photograph, a young face, 16 years old, looking straight at the camera with the quiet confidence of someone who still had so much time ahead. Days turned into weeks. Searches continued, but no new information came forward. No one reported seeing him after he left the coffee shop. No belongings turned up in unusual places. No one called with a tip that led anywhere solid. The case remained open and active, but the trail grew cold. In 1973, police work relied on physical searches, witness accounts, and local knowledge. There were no cell phones to track, no widespread surveillance cameras, no digital records to review. Once the immediate leads dried up, the investigation slowed, though the file stayed on record. The family kept looking in their own way. They talked to people, they checked back with the police, they held on to the hope that Norman had simply gone somewhere unexpected and would return when he was ready. But as time passed, the silence became more difficult to bear. The house felt emptier. Conversations turned to memories rather than plans. Isaac, Norman's younger brother, grew older while carrying the weight of a brother who had vanished without explanation. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the south, on the night of July 9, 1973, almost exactly 6 months after Norman was last seen, something entirely separate occurred along Highway 35 near Rockport, Texas, in Aransas County. A vehicle struck a pedestrian. The driver did not stop. The victim, a white male estimated to be in his mid-teens, was left on the side of the road. He was found by passing motorists who called for help, but despite efforts to save him, he did not survive the injuries. Local authorities in Aransas County responded immediately. The body was taken for examination. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be consistent with a hit-and-run collision. Efforts were made to identify the young man. Descriptions were released to the media. Local newspapers and radio stations carried appeals for information. Authorities searched for any missing person reports that might match, checking with nearby counties, with state agencies, with anyone who might recognize the description. No one came forward. No family reported a missing teenager fitting the details. No missing person file from Dallas or anywhere else connected to the case at that time. In 1973, information traveled slowly. Police departments in different parts of the state did not have instant access to each other's records. Databases were paper files, not shared networks. Communication between Dallas and Aransas County was limited to phone calls or mailed reports, and only when someone thought to make the connection. No one did. The unidentified young man became known in records as Aransas John Doe. His case remained open, but without identification, it moved to the background. The body was held for a period. Then, as time passed and no relatives were located, standard procedures were followed. The file was archived. The story faded from local headlines. For more than 50 years, these two events, the disappearance of Norman Prater in Dallas and the hit-and-run death of an unidentified teenager near Rockport, Texas, in Aransas County, remained completely separate. One was a missing person case in a large city. The other was an unsolved hit-and-run in a coastal county. Hundreds of miles apart, 6 months apart, No shared names, no overlapping details, no reason for investigators in either place to link them. Technology in 1973 simply did not allow for the kind of cross-checking that happens today. The two stories existed in parallel, untouched by each other, while the Prater family continued to wait in Dallas and the Aransas County authorities kept an old file that had no name attached. The years accumulated. Decades passed. Norman would have turned 20, 30, 40, 50. The age-progressed images released by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children showed a man who never aged in reality. Isaac Prater grew up, built his own life, but never stopped carrying the question of what happened to his brother. The Dallas Police Department kept the case active, the longest-running missing persons investigation in their history. Every so often, a new tip would arrive. Detectives would review the file again. Nothing changed. In Aransas County, the unidentified remains file waited in storage, part of the quiet archive of unresolved cases from the 1970s. Photographs from the medical examiner's office were kept, along with notes and reports. Time moved forward. People retired. Records were preserved, but rarely revisited. For over 50 years, these two stories stayed separate, two threads in the vast fabric of the past, never touching, until in late 2025 and early 2026, a detective in Dallas refused to let history stay buried. By the end of 2025, more than 52 years had passed since Norman Prater walked out of that coffee shop in Dallas. The file in the Dallas Police Department records room had grown thick with notes, old reports, faded photographs, and the occasional new entry whenever a tip arrived and was checked. It was still listed as active, the department's oldest open missing persons case, but the pace of investigation had long since slowed to occasional reviews rather than daily effort. Across the state, in Aransas County, the file labeled Aransas John Doe from July 9, 1973 had followed a similar path, preserved, archived, rarely touched, but never officially closed. Then, late in 2025, something routine shifted the course of both cases. Staff at the Aransas County Medical Examiner's Office began a scheduled review of older unidentified remains files, a process many offices conduct periodically to ensure records are up to date, photographs are properly digitized if they haven't been, and any new tools or methods might apply. During this review, they located an existing photograph from the original examination of the unidentified young man found on Highway 35 near Rockport. It was a more detailed morgue photograph than what had been used in earlier appeals, one that captured clearer views of facial features, specific markings, and physical characteristics. The staff recognized that this image could be useful for renewed identification efforts. They followed standard procedure and shared the photograph with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. NCMEC maintains one of the most comprehensive databases for long-term missing persons and unidentified remains in the country. They receive and catalog such images, compare them against missing persons reports, and distribute them to law enforcement agencies when potential matches appear. The photograph made its way through that network. Eventually, it reached Detective Ryan Dalby of the Dallas Police Department. Detective Dalby had been assigned to cold cases, including missing persons investigations that had lingered for decades. He was familiar with the Norman Prater file, not because it was constantly on his desk, but because it was the department's longest-running case, the one that appeared in training materials, in discussions about persistence, and in reminders that some files simply wait longer than others. When the photograph arrived from NCMEC, Dalby opened the Prater file again. He placed the new image from Aransas County alongside the photographs of Norman taken in 1973, the school picture, the family snapshots, the description that had been circulated all those years ago. He studied them carefully. He noted the age estimate for the unidentified remains, a young male in his mid-teens, consistent with Norman's 16 years in January of 1973. He looked at the facial structure, the shape of the jaw, the spacing of the eyes, the overall proportions. He paid close attention to distinctive details, scars or marks that had been documented on Norman's body before he disappeared, features that time would not have altered on the remains found in 1973. The match was not immediate or obvious at first glance, but as Dalby continued to compare point by point, he saw what he described as a compelling correspondence. He did not stop at his own assessment. He consulted a forensic analyst with the Texas Rangers, a specialist trained in visual identification techniques for cases where traditional methods like DNA or fingerprints are not immediately available. The analyst reviewed the same images, the original 1973 photographs of Norman, the age-progressed renderings created over the years, and the detailed morgue photograph from Aransas County. After careful examination, the analyst concluded there was a high probability that the unidentified young man from 1973 was Norman Prater. What made this identification possible without DNA or fingerprints was the quality of the preserved records and the clarity of the newly shared photograph. Visual comparison, supported by measurements, scar placement, and general physical characteristics, provided enough certainty to move forward. In many older cases, especially from the 1970s, DNA evidence was not collected or preserved in the way it is today. Fingerprints might have degraded or never been obtained from the remains, but photographs, when taken carefully and stored properly, endure. They become the bridge across decades. With this preliminary confirmation in hand, Detective Dalby took the next essential step. He located Norman's brother, Isaac Prater, who was living in Lewisville, Texas, not far from Dallas. Isaac had grown up without his older brother, had built a life of his own, yet had always remained open to any news from the police. Dalby contacted him and arranged to meet. He brought the photograph from Aransas County, along with the original images of Norman and the analyst's findings. Isaac looked at the photograph. He studied it quietly. He recognized the familiar features, the way the face was shaped, the specific scars he remembered from childhood, the overall appearance that matched the brother he had last seen when he was younger. After a long moment, Isaac spoke the words that closed a chapter more than half a century in the making. He said, "You can close the case." That confirmation provided the final piece. The Dallas Police Department was now able to link the missing persons report from January 14, 1973 to the unidentified remains found on July 9, 1973. The two files, one in Dallas, one in Aransas, were officially connected. The case of Norman Prater was resolved as a tragic accident, a hit-and-run on a highway far from home, with no evidence of any other circumstances. The unidentified young man, known for decades as Aransas John Doe, was given back his name. The Dallas Police Department made the announcement public between January 2nd and January 6th, 2026. Chief Daniel Comio spoke about the resolution, describing it as a testament to the commitment of investigators who never fully set aside the older files. He noted the collaboration between agencies, the Aransas County Medical Examiner's Office, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the Texas Rangers, and the Dallas Police Department. He acknowledged the family's long wait and the importance of providing answers, even when those answers come after so much time has passed. For the Prater family, the news brought a form of closure that seemed out of reach for 52 years. Isaac Prater, who had carried the memory of his brother through every stage of his own life, now knew the circumstances of Norman's death. There were no mysteries of foul play to pursue further. There was no need to wonder whether Norman had chosen to leave or had met with harm in Dallas. Instead, there was the quiet reality of a young man who had traveled far from home, likely by hitchhiking, as was more common in that era, and who had been struck by a vehicle that did not stop. The driver of that vehicle was never identified, The hit and run itself remains unresolved in that sense, as many from the 1970s do, with no witnesses and no physical evidence that pointed to a specific person. But for the purpose of the missing persons case, the question of what happened to Norman Prater was answered. This breakthrough came not from new technology like genetic genealogy, which has solved so many other long-term cases in recent years. It came from the careful preservation of old photographs, from a routine file review in one county, from a detective willing to spend time comparing images, and from a brother's clear recognition of the brother he had lost. In early 2026, two cases that had existed in isolation for more than half a century were finally joined. Norman Prater's name was removed from the list of missing persons. Aransas John Doe received his identity back. And the Dallas Police Department's oldest missing persons investigation was at last closed.
52 years is a lifetime. It is long enough for a child to grow into an adult, to build a career, to raise children of their own, to see grandchildren enter the world. It is long enough for entire generations to come and go, for cities to change, for technology to transform the way people live and remember. For Isaac Prater, those 52 years carried a different kind of weight. He grew up without the older brother who had once walked beside him, shared stories with him, promised to come back the next day to help move furniture. Isaac carried that absence through every stage of his life, through school, through work, through family milestones, through quiet evenings when the house felt just a little too still. He never stopped wondering. He never stopped hoping that one day the phone might ring, that a letter might arrive, that someone would say, "We found him." And then, in the first week of January 2026, that day arrived. Detective Ryan Dalby came to Isaac's home in Louisville. He brought the photographs, the original images of Norman from 1973, the age-progressed portraits that had been created over the decades, and the detailed morgue photograph from Aransas County that had waited in storage since 1973. Isaac looked at them carefully. He studied the face he had known as a boy. He recognized the shape of the features, the placement of the scars, the quiet familiarity of the person he had lost when he was still young. After all those years, he gave the confirmation that allowed the case to close. He said the words that ended one chapter and began another. You can close the case. In that moment, the uncertainty that had stretched across more than half a century came to an end. Isaac finally knew what had happened to his brother. Norman had not chosen to disappear. He had not met with deliberate harm in the streets of Dallas. He had traveled, likely by hitchhiking, a common way for young people to move around the country in the early 1970s. And somewhere along Highway 35 near Rockport, a vehicle had struck him. The driver had not stopped. Norman had not survived. That was the answer. It was not the answer anyone had wished for. There is no easy comfort in learning that a 16-year-old boy died alone on the side of a highway far from home. But it was an answer. After 52 years of open questions, of wondering where Norman had gone, of imagining every possible scenario, of holding space for the possibility that he might still walk through the door, the family received finality. It was bittersweet peace. The grief remained because the loss remained, but the long, quiet ache of not knowing was lifted. Isaac could now speak of his brother with the certainty that comes from understanding the full story. The family could mark Norman's birthdays and remember him without the constant pull of what if. They could carry forward knowing the truth, however hard that truth may be. And for anyone who has ever waited for answers in a long, unsolved case, this resolution offers a measure of hope.
time does not always erase the possibility of knowing. Persistence, careful work, and the simple act of looking again can still bring light to old shadows. We have followed the story of Norman Prater from a single January night in 1973 to the moment more than 52 years later when answers finally arrived. A 16-year-old boy steps out of a coffee shop after a brief visit with his mother. He promises to return the next day to help with moving. He walks into the Dallas night and is never seen again by his family. For decades, the question lingers. What happened to him? Where did he go? Why did he not come home? Now we know. A tragic accident on a highway far from Dallas. A vehicle that did not stop. A young life ended in an instant, hundreds of miles from the streets he knew. The pieces fit together through photographs preserved across time, through the careful eyes of a detective, through the recognition of a brother who had waited half a century to understand. The Dallas Police Department closes its oldest missing persons case. The Aransas County Medical Examiner's Office preserved photographs and records that might have been discarded elsewhere. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children served as the bridge, sharing information across jurisdictions. The Texas Rangers provided forensic expertise. Each part contributed something essential. No single person or office solved this alone. It was the result of many hands, many minds, many years of quiet care for the details that others might overlook. For anyone who has ever wondered about an old case, whether it involves a family member, a friend, a neighbor, or simply someone whose story has stayed with them, there is a practical step to take. If you have information about any long unsolved missing person, any unidentified remains, any detail that might connect to a case from years ago, contact the authorities. Reach out to your local police department. Contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Share what you know, even if it seems small. Even the smallest piece can become the key that fits after decades. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the value of persistence and the importance of remembering those who are missing, consider subscribing to this channel. We continue to cover solved mysteries and recent breakthroughs, cases where time, dedication, and careful work bring answers after years or even decades of waiting. We explore the human side of these investigations, the families who never give up, the investigators who keep looking. If you would like to see more stories like this one, please like this video. Leave a comment below. What cold case would you like us to cover next? Share the name, the year, the place, whatever details you remember. Your suggestions help guide the next video. Before we end, take a moment to remember Norman Prater, not just as a name in a file, not just as a case number, but as a young person whose life was full of ordinary promise. A boy who ordered a soft drink, sat with his mother, made a simple promise to help the next day. His story did not end the way anyone hoped, but it did not end in permanent silence either. Thanks to the work of many people over many years, his name is spoken again. His family has closure. His memory is honored. Justice delayed, but never forgotten. Thank you for watching. Until the next story.